and welcome to the Ontario Invasive Plant Council's 2017-2018 webinar series. My name is Belinda Junkin, and I'm the new Executive Director of the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. And I'm hosting today's webinar from Peterborough, Ontario. Colin is sitting beside me. He's a little under the weather, but he's running the controls. If this is your first time joining the Ontario Invasive Plant Council for a webinar, welcome and thanks for joining us. If you're a return customer, welcome back. Housekeeping notes before we begin today's webinar. These have been placed on mute to start the webinar, and we encourage you to introduce yourself using the chat feature on the bar on the right of the screen. Today's webinar presentation will begin shortly and last for approximately 45 minutes. Attendees will then have an opportunity to ask questions by writing them in the WebEx chat feature. With that, let's move on to today's webinar. Today's presentation will be delivered by Eric Cleveland, Invasive Species Director with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. He had numerous habitat restorations and land stewardship projects over his career with a variety of organizations. Eric's current focus is leading NBC's goal to preserve and restore the biodiversity of coastal wetlands in lower Great Lakes, with an emphasis on invasive species management, particularly Phragmites australis. In the Q&A period, we will also be joined by Michael Irvin and Justin Behoff, both from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, to provide more context on this complex and evolving project. And now I'll turn it over to Eric for today's webinar.
Thank you, Linda. Good afternoon, everyone. Much like Colin, I'm also slightly under the weather today, so bear with me as I work my way through the presentation this afternoon. So I want to talk a little bit about partner with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry on Phragmites control efforts. For the slides to catch up here. It doesn't appear the slides are advancing.
I'm just working here, and we'll pass you back the baton and see if that clears it.
Okay, thank you. So, does everyone see the title slide now? So, I'll summarize the project briefly here. The Nature Conservancy of Canada has partnered with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry to collaborate on some significant coastal wetlands, primarily in the Lake Erie region, through an emergency use registration of a glyphosate-based product called Roundup Custom treatment of Phragmites australis, which is a well-known invader probably to most folks on this call, and certainly to those working in these systems in Lake Erie. So background, I think many of you may be well aware of the threat that Phragmites australis poses to a lot of these very significant and highly biodiverse wetlands. A bit of background on the plant, of course, it's a perennial grass, and its primary method of spread is through rhizomes and stolons and seeds as well, where you have soil disturbance as the main vectors for spread. The biggest threat is the fact that it chokes out dense stands. It forms dense stands that choke out other vegetation and is incredibly inhospitable to wildlife. We have seen some wildlife use the very edge of these stands where it's not fully inundated at 100% levels, but for the most part, they're very void of wildlife, and of course, putting significant pressure on our wildlife, and particularly species at risk. On top of these, its incredible ability to grow and overtake these wetlands. It is allelopathic, so it emits a toxic chemical, which essentially helps prevent the establishment of other native species. I likely heard that it was noted as Canada's worst invasive plant almost 15 years ago now by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And it's a native to Europe primarily, and due to that fact, of course, there's no natural controls in North America. So where this project is taking place, the project's been evolving over the last 2 or 3 years with a focus on two main areas in the province, one being Rondeau Provincial Park and the second one being the Long Point region. I focus a primary part of this presentation on the Long Point region, as that's the area where the Nature Conservancy is participating on a larger scale. On this map, you can see there are 5 main areas in Long Point. For those who don't know, Long Point is about a 40-kilometer long sand spit that sticks out into the middle of Lake Erie. It's, for the most part, one of the few remaining wild places in southern Ontario, lots of natural habitat, and you can see there's a mix of ownerships in this slide here. There's a federal government through the Canadian Wildlife Service that owns much of the lands in orange. Provincial Crown through the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry owns the yellow areas. There's a number of private hunt clubs that are in the Turkey Point and in the lower Big Creek areas, primarily in blue and brown on this slide, and a couple of other NGOs that have some small holdings both at the base of the point and further out towards the tip. All areas are considered to be provincially significant wetlands and are heavily infested with Phragmites australis. It's a big deal. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of focus on these wetlands in the Long Point region, and there is good rationale for support to do the work in this area. I think the key thing that really empowered us to do the work in these areas is Long Point and Rondeau are natural functioning coastal wetlands. So maintain their natural hydrological pulses with the raising and lowering of water levels in Lake Erie. Sesh events that come in and provide a flushing and a regenerative action in these wetlands are still left unchecked, as opposed to some of the other wetlands that are diked and fairly well managed water levels. There's numerous designations on these wetlands in the area. It's well known as a UNESCO World Biosphere Reserve. There's both earth and life science areas of natural and scientific interest. As mentioned, they're provincially significant wetlands. It's an internationally recognized Ramsar wetland site. Of course, it's an important bird area and a major stopover point for an incredible amount of water birds and land birds on their annual migration routes in the spring and fall. Critical point as well is it provides habitat for approximately 23 species at risk that are dependent on wetlands, primarily for a large part of their life requirements. That point is particularly interesting as it was a strong piece of rationale to support the emergency use registration that NRF submitted in order to undertake this work. Of course, high number of provincially rare species and vegetation communities found throughout the point, everything from shallow emergent wetlands to interdunal wetlands, sand dune and oak savanna type communities mixed throughout the point, all of which are impacted by Phragmites to more or less of a degree. I think about focusing in the Long Point region really is there is a significant opportunity to have a true landscape scale impact. So with the diversity of ownerships, primarily with an interest in conservation in some form, it really provides a suite of interested landowners that would like to tackle the problem and in some cases have the resources to assist. So where Nature Conservancy of Canada fit in? Our primary role to date has been supporting the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry in their application to Health Canada's Pest Management Regulatory Agency for emergency use registration of the Roundup Custom product. That product is available for use on the shelf, if you will, across the other Lake Erie and our neighboring states, and it's used very successfully over there. And with a strong science background to support its safety when used responsibly. So it was the right product to do the job here, and MNRF supported an application for 2 years in a row now to undertake this work. Operationally is leading control work on private lands in the Long Point area, which now includes Lower Big Creek and Turkey Point, as you saw on that initial map. Looking at both the aerial and the ground portion, so supporting where we can to engage with landowners and help deliver the project and the follow-up best management practices, herbicide treatment. A key to doing this work, I think if folks are considering similar type projects in their area, is having a well thought out communication and monitoring plan, and NCC has been pleased to support MNRF in delivering those 2 plans. That's everything from engaging the community and having public information sessions and talking about what we want to do, where we're going to do it, and how we're going to do it, but also follow-up monitoring, so actually sampling the quality of water and sediment and soils, and helping to demonstrate the safety and the responsibility of the work that we're undertaking. A really key piece of doing this type of work is having the community on board. I think successful indirect contributions we've been able to make to the project is the development of the Long Point Phragmites Action Alliance. And this is essentially a group of over 25 organizations that have an interest in seeing Phragmites removed or eradicated from the landscape. This has been incredibly powerful in helping us pull together public information sessions, get support from all sectors of the community. We have everything from the federal government to the municipal government to all the environmental non-government organizations locally, the agricultural community, the local roads crews. It's been really a well-rounded group that has helped drum up the support we need and help build the understanding in the public of the need to do this work and responsible fashion by which it's undertaken. For how we do this work, you need tools, you need a variety of tools. Anyone who's participated in a Phragmites control program knows very well that there's a wide suite of options out there to undertake the work, and you really need to have access to all of those options to have a successful control program, particularly on the scale of what we were hoping to achieve in the Long Point region. You can slide the 3 main tools we've used as part of this project. Helicopter, which I'll talk about shortly, NCC's Master, which is a track machine for traversing remote wetlands, also a John boat with a mud motor to get through shallow emergent wetlands and tackle those areas where those 2 other pieces of equipment simply can't access. So in 2017, we undertook about 236 hectares aerially. The share of this work was in the Turkey Point area, which I'll show a map of shortly. There was also a portion of it treated in the Long Point Crown Marsh, which is under MNRF ownership. And the year was again led by the Ministry of Natural Resources through their procurement process. It was awarded to Expedition Helicopters, which is the same company that provided services in 2016. And it's really important to think about some of the considerations that are needed when you're going to, fly a helicopter over top of a significant wetland using an herbicide. And we worked very closely with MNRF and Health Canada and the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change to come up with some guidelines and limitations on the equipment that we would require to undertake this work. Some of the things we checked for this particular project was using a GPS-based software to control the spray booms. So essentially what that means is we are mapping the Phragmites ahead of time and loading up the GIS files directly into the software on the helicopter. And as the pilot flies over these polygons, he doesn't have to actually control the spray. This is controlled through the computer system itself. So the computer will only turn on when it flies over an identified Phragmites polygon and turn off before it reaches the other side. The nice thing about this software is it accounts for the height and the speed of the aircraft and can adjust the opening and closing of the nozzle nozzles accordingly. So it's very precise in its application method, and which is exactly the reason why we required this type of software for this job. Some of we spec the aircraft with were AccuFlow nozzles set at the ASAE coarse classification size, which really means essentially a very large droplet size. The reason that we wanted a large droplet size, of course, was to minimize the potential for non-target impacts through drift. And our initial estimates look like this is a very effective way to help minimize the off-site impact. I'll show you a slide shortly that demonstrates the spray pattern of these nozzles. A couple other things that were really critical to ensuring that the application went in the actual location it was intended for was a maximum height requirement. The helicopter cannot fly above 3 meters from the top of the seed head of the Phragmite plants when it's undertaking treatment. So that's just slightly under 10 feet. So if you think about the ceiling above the head in the room you're probably sitting in now, that's about the height that the helicopter is flying over top of these plants. It's nice to be able to combine that with the GPS software and allows the pilot to fully focus on safety and flying and not have to worry about turning the spray booms on and off at the same time. A mitigation factor that we put in place on this project was a maximum aircraft speed of 60 kilometers an hour. That is about the slowest a helicopter can safely fly and maneuver effectively while treating a plant. So that's a great way to ensure that you're not overshooting any of your polygons and that the GPS software can keep up with the helicopter accordingly. And the last thing is monitoring the actual environmental conditions on the day of the spray. And one of those key factors is making sure we have a wind that is below 16 kilometers an hour total speed, not zero, so that we can avoid a temperature inversion which might occur on a still day and cause the herbicide to move to a location that wasn't intended. A little bit about the importance of the spray nozzles and the calibration. One of the things we're required to do by permit on this project is to undertake a calibration exercise of the helicopter before we undertake any treatment. So this is a photo on the left of the spray crew laying down the calibration tape across the runway, and you can see very far off in the distance the helicopter waiting to come across and fly at the prescribed height and speed. And what you see on the right there is the end result of a tank of dyed treatment water up on the ticker tape. And what you notice on that tape is indeed very large droplet sizes. Some of them are greater than a centimeter in diameter, but there are, more importantly, no fine dots on that tape, which would allow for an increased opportunity for drift off-site. Part to make sure that you can prove that you've met the conditions of the permit and that you can be satisfied that the equipment is set up to perform exercise exactly as prescribed. But what we actually did, this is a map of the aerial treatment at the Turkey Point wetland complex, and what you're essentially seeing here is the solder tracks and the spray boom is turned on and when it's turned off again. So that's the difference in colors you're seeing in the map here. Or is when the helicopter is flying along without the spray booms turned on, and as they're turned on you can see that's in the green areas as well. So the green areas on this map correlate to patches of Phragmites that were treated aerially. Total 136 hectares. We undertook slightly more area by ground treatment this year, approximately 254 hectares. On the left there you can see a marsh master moving along through a Phragmites stand treating the plants. We handheld gun with a pressure-based system, say a hydraulic pressure system, and we find it to be very effective as opposed to a boom type system on the ground. The nice thing about this system is the wand allows the exterminator to put the product directly on the plant. You can drive adjacent to the stand or through the stand and capture rather precise application and be selective around say, non-target vegetation that you don't want to treat. So in 2017, we were very fortunate to have 2 marsh masters, one by the Nature Conservancy of Canada and the second one owned by the contractor who was successful in bidding for the work. The thing about marsh masters is they're an all-aluminum amphibious vehicle, so they're very lightweight and they have a very wide track design, which is intended to reduce their ground pressure to minimize impacts to the wetland. Amphibious, so we've learned that through a number of years of doing this type of work that it's absolutely critical in the coastal wetlands to have a vehicle that's fully amphibious to undertake the work. Many times you need to cross a channel to access a Phragmites patch on the other side, and if you were to have to go around, it would increase the travel time and also your footprint on the property. So being able to simply slip across a deep wet area is a huge advantage in actually operationally achieving the quantity area that you're hoping to achieve in a given year. The thing with marsh masters is we found they're quite simply they're built to work in these tough conditions. It's the primary function of the design. We have used other track machines in the past without success. We find they're not quite up to the task of large-scale programs. So while expensive, the Marsh Master was absolutely essential to success of this project. Another piece that we brought into the 2017 project was the use of a 20-foot John boat, and you can see that in the bottom right with a mud motor attached to it. We did that with an IntelliSpray system, which is a GPS-powered reel system, so the exterminator can actually get out of the boat and walk and pull a hose with him. But the nice thing about the IntelliSpray system is that you don't actually have to pull the hose, it self-feeds as you walk along. So it reduces exterminator fatigue significantly because it feeds out the hose and also brings the hose back. And it's actually strong enough that it can actually help pull the exterminator up a hill or a steep embankment if necessary, if they're trying to reach a very distant patch. And it's actually designed to do that as assistance to the exterminator. So a very critical piece of equipment as well when you're working in a wetland system that has extensive channels, for example. Comment that we received about the John boat was that it's quite large. Most waterfowl clubs that use these types of boats to get through their wetlands use a much smaller John boat. A 20-foot was necessary in order to support the capacity of the spray unit and the actual spray mix, which becomes quite heavy once the tank is full. So we find while it was large and does have an impact on the actual event, the maneuverability of the boat, it is necessary to carry the volume of herbicide required. But a boat was done on ground, so if you compare this to the previous map of aerial areas, this is essentially the outer edge all the way around areas that the helicopter wasn't unable to treat. The reason the helicopter was unable to treat a number of these areas is our permit requirements had a 125-meter buffer from adjacent property and non-target values, and that's essentially what you're seeing reflected in this map here as well. I think the important thing to note about this map is how much of the map is covered in the orange hash marks over top of the yellow Phragmites and how much is not. The key piece that we've learned over the last couple of years of doing this work is there's always more frag out there than you have mapped or think there is. And this map really illustrates that quite well. Everywhere that there is orange hash marks was Phragmites that we had mapped ahead of time. And the yellow was Phragmites that actually was treated by the contractor when they were out there. In some instances, we found that was nearly double the So keep in mind as you're planning this type of program that there's really more out there to be dealt with while you're on site, and of course you do want to tackle those patches that weren't mapped while you're in the area with the appropriate authorizations to do the work. Ground treatment in the lower Big Creek area. This is the major watershed that feeds into the Long Point Inner Bay, and it's really privately held. We worked mostly on the northern side of the Big Creek watershed in 2017. And you can see, again here, there were a number of areas that were treated that were not originally mapped. We found this area to be particularly challenging because as we moved up these wetlands along the Big Creek system, there was a lot more trees and shrubs and native Phragmites that we're trying to avoid as part of the project, so it was a lot slower going. Another consideration for those planning this type of project is really have a look at the site ahead of time before you go in, because some wetlands are much easier to accomplish Phragmites control in than others. A lot of non-target values and things you want to keep or the landowner has a strong interest in, it will require extra time and resources to work around them. So in Lower Big Creek, about 21.9 hectares. I think we had originally mapped close to 15, so a substantial increase over the original mapped area. We're out Long Point, about halfway out, we treated a fair bit of areas from ground this year at the Long Point Company private wetland and also Bird Studies Canada's private lands out there. A total of nearly 151 hectares between the two properties. Point Company participated in the project in 2016 as well, so you wonder why some of the areas further out in the marsh were not treated in 2017. That is leftovers from mapping from previous years, and there was about 375 hectares treated by helicopter in 2016 at this property as well. So the 2017 project focused primarily on the south part of the property, as you can see in the map, and very large areas that were not originally mapped as being heavily infested with Phragmites, but were nearly 100% density once we got there and had an opportunity to look on the ground. M&R participated at their wetland, the Long Point Crown Marsh, and you can see here on the map there were two main methods of treatment. The groundwork was primarily the areas you see in yellow here, and the areas in pink were treated with the helicopter. This is a site that was also treated in 2016, so much of the areas in the sort of the northwest portion of the marsh were treated by helicopter last year, and as such they were just picking up some small mist areas and regrowth areas in that part of the marsh, and then focusing on the inner marsh where helicopter wasn't a feasible option for treatment. So 31.2 hectares at the Long Point Crown Marsh. And just the very left side of this particular map, you can see some yellow polygons that were treated along the Long Point Causeway, which heads out from mainland towards the community of Long Point and feeds the Long Point Crown Marsh and the Long Point Provincial Park. There was a small area there that was included with the numbers for the Lower Big Creek area. So overall, a fairly decent and beginning to look like a landscape scale program in Long Point, which is great. So one of the things that we've tried to do with this project over the years is improve the technology, improve our tracking and our monitoring each year as we learn from the previous year's experiences. One new piece of technology for 2017 was the addition of a test software on the actual spray trigger for the ground crews. So seeing on this map is essentially GPS points that are recorded from the actual wand of the grenadier's every time it pulls the trigger, it records a spray point, and the spray point is sent to via Bluetooth to a phone or tablet, which is then sent to a cloud-based system, and someone like the program manager can sit in their office and actually see the points load live on the screen and watch what the actual exterminator is doing on the ground. This is really helpful when it comes time to putting together reports for your permits and authorizations for the project. And anything that I would recommend, if you're doing a decent-sized program, I'd be happy to share the details with the company where we got this software from. It's MRF Sprayer Systems, and they are based out of Calgary, Alberta. And so a fairly reasonable system that provides excellent tracking. course, we do all of this work without fair monitoring, and I'm not going to go into the details for some of the results of the monitoring. It's not fully available as of yet, but we were asked and interested in a number of things as part of our monitoring program this year. First and foremost, a lot of this work is occurring around communities, cottage associations, a lot of private land, and we wanted to make sure that drinking water was protected first and foremost. So that is something we monitored for. We also, in certain areas, asked for water system shutdowns that were adjacent to treatment areas as really a precautionary measure. Our monitoring has shown that it's not necessarily a requirement due to the levels that we've seen in our monitoring. However, we took a precautionary approach to make sure that the residents were certainly kept safe. So that's job number one as far as monitoring. Of course, efficacy, we want to know if it works, and the numbers that we've seen from our 2016 program show incredible efficacy, and we hope to see that again from the 2017 monitoring that will occur this growing season. And that a lot of folks were wondering about was the fate of the herbicide, both in the water column and the sediment at the base of some of these wetlands. That work is currently underway from an analysis standpoint through the University of Waterloo, and we hope to have the reports for that very soon. Another interesting thing that we looked at was the impacts to aquatic organisms, and really what we're going to do here is confirm what existing science tells us from other jurisdictions, that there's minimal opportunity for toxicity to aquatic life. Permits from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, both under the Species at Risk Act and the Fisheries Act, which require us to monitor effects on fish and fish habitat. Overall, looking very positive from those results, and hopefully we'll have reports to that nature very soon. Another thing being measured by the University of Waterloo is the sensitive vegetation community response, and what that means is, so when we undertake this work, we know that we can be effective at removing Phragmites, but what does that mean? What recolonizes these sites after we have undertaken this work with an herbicide, and how long does that take for that to happen? So we have some long-term monitoring in place to answer some of those questions. Another thing we've looked at is the invertebrate community, and we did a fair bit of benthic monitoring this year in partnership with the University of Waterloo and the University of Windsor to look at potential for toxicity in the invertebrate community, and we're still waiting for results there, but initial indications look quite positive. And NC has been taking part in the Phragmites Adaptive Management Framework, which some of you on the call are familiar with. And really, this is a great program that tries to synthesize all of the different application methods and follow-up best management practices that are being done in the Great Lakes region, and is to put it together into an algorithm, essentially, that will offer you some suggestions on what may work based on your site and your conditions and your resources available for treatment. That's something that's available through the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative, if you haven't heard of the PAF protocol. So we go from here. Well, we taught through this project, just by the very nature of it, about herbicide treatment, but the reality is there are many other aspects to putting together a Phragmites control program. MNRF has a good best management practice document that recommends cutting, rolling, or prescribed burning as a follow-up measure to remove biomass from the site, and that's the stage we're currently working at now. Of course, working in these wetlands with heavy equipment, cutters and rollers and things like that, the winter season is the best season to undertake this work. Of course, it can be a challenging season for those that live and work in these wetlands. They understand that ice levels are quite a bit thinner in and around the vegetation of the wetlands as opposed to open water. Doing our best to get as much of these treated areas cut, rolled, and where possible burned over the course of the winter. Ideally, we would continue to build upon this work, fill in some of the gaps from the 2016 and 17 programs with other application in 2018, focused primarily along Point region. And really, we know that there will be some regrowth from those first 2 years. We saw some of it in 2017 and a couple of areas from the 2016 treatment, and we know we'll be back to be particularly careful when we re-enter these sites. One of the big questions we have now to answer is how do we best get into these sites to the very small percentage of volunteers that have recolonized having an impact on any vegetation that's growing or any wildlife that are using these sites because of our efforts the previous year. Well, there's some questions there and perhaps not every answer, but we're certainly working on some solutions. So I'm done there, but I'd like to just take a moment and thank the folks that helped make this project possible. The Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry have been incredible in supporting this work. Ducks Unlimited Canada has been a strong partner as well. We couldn't without our funders. The Ontario Petroleum Foundation has been an excellent funding source. The Government of Canada provided financial assistance through the National Wetland Conservation Fund, and of course, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry directly contributed as well. And lastly, and it's as important as all the rest, is the funds that were contributed by the private landowners themselves to help locate this plant at the local level. So I think we could open it up to questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eric. That was really interesting. I remind all of our participants to use the chat feature on the right-hand side to ask any questions. We have Eric, Dustin, and Michael standing by to help us. So I will start off with one of the questions that's already been presented this morning. Are any side effects on other species? Maybe, Eric, if I could ask you to kick that off, or if you'd like to hand it off to someone else, just so.
That's a really broad question. I think the reality of undertaking this work, a non-selective herbicide that's based on glyphosate, the reality is if the product's not applied directly to the plant that you're targeting, there's an opportunity to impact other living plants at the same time because it is a non-selective herbicide. Really in determining whether the impact warrants the activity or not, and really our motto on this project has been do the best good with the least harm, and that's why we've been trying to use the equipment possible, the best technology possible to minimize our impact, knowing there will be to some degree with any project of this scale and size and any problem, a resource management problem of this scale and size. So the potential for impact is there. Really what it's important to consider is the mitigation measures. So whether it's really to wildlife or plants, there are different aspects that you can put in place to help mitigate. Dustin or Michael have any other comments on that?
Yeah, it's Dustin here. I can just add, just through 2 years of doing fish monitoring, before-after control impact for spring, we haven't seen anything out of the ordinary in terms of mass fish kills. So we can kind of rule that out, at least as far as a major impact goes.
And nothing for me to add. Thanks.
Just to further that question, what is the timing of the spraying? I'm assuming the season or the period. And how many days are you out spraying, or are you out spraying to do this project?
Sure, I can tackle that one. The timing is as late as we can reasonably delay it in season, but still have a strong effect on the biology or the phenology of the plant. We want to make sure that we're applying the herbicide to the Phragmites at the post-flowering. We know that the plant is beginning to prepare for its overwintering processes and taking its energy reserves down to the root system, and with that transfer also the glyphosate product. The big challenge is not killing the above-ground growth with Phragmites, but is really trying to get to the root system, which is where we get the regrowth coming in the subsequent years. So way later in the season, so the earliest you want to start is in the month of August, halfway through is best. But primarily, most of the project occurs in the month of September. Once you get into October, you start running the risk of a frost, which would compromise the program. So for this year, most of the real application was done over a 4-day period in the middle of September. And the ground program being much slower in nature, just simply by design, occurred from the last week of August through to the first week of October.
Another question, Eric, that came in, are you flushing out any wildlife before you commence the aerial spraying?
Yeah, a project of this scale, it's not realistically feasible. One of the reasons that we use a helicopter for this type of work is to get to these remote areas that we simply can't access reasonably. As I mentioned, the helicopter can cover that 236 hectares in 4 days. There's no way to put any type of equipment on the ground ahead of time in front of the helicopter, to flush the wildlife, I guess, as the question is asked. It does naturally happen. Ducks, birds, and herons can fly out in front of the helicopter. Our experience is that once the helicopter is in and working in the wetland, wildlife move to the other side, and they tend to move back. And if you have a good view, you can actually see the birds flying between locations, out of the way of the aircraft by a long shot. It is something that needs to be carefully monitored, particularly by the pilot, to avoid a collision, obviously, with something like a heron. Really, it's not feasible to do in front of something large scale like a helicopter. When it comes to the ground program, the Marshmaster moves incredibly slow, and just by nature of treating Phragmites, spends a lot of time stopped, and then it'll creep at about 1 kilometer an hour and stop. What we've experienced in working in these wetlands is if you can train your operator for the Marshmaster to stick to the Phragmites patch for travel, you're really minimizing the risk of impacting wildlife because you simply aren't able to access the center of most of these Phragmites stands due to the decay. A good example is that first photo I showed in my presentation where the contractor was standing there and there was a 20-foot tall Phragmites plant behind him. Those things at Long Point are so old and so dense, they're really inhospitable to wildlife, which is, of course, the basis for undertaking this project.
Another question, Eric, was how would someone or a group start a project like that? How do they get the inventory of what they have?
Right, it really depends on the size of the project. I think if I were to offer one key piece of advice, I guess 2 things come to mind. One, start before you go where the plant is. Make sure you have the support locally to do the work. Really, it's important to engage the community. It's important to build awareness. It's important to educate people about safe and responsible use of herbicides. People, quite rightfully so, will become quite concerned about flying a helicopter over a wetland and treating it with herbicide. There has been, people are concerned with that type of activity, and once you explain to them the method that you use, the droplet size, the height, and all those types of measures that are put in place to show a responsibly organized program, you can win, the naysayers over to your side, particularly if they have an interest in these wetlands, which most adjacent folks do. So I would say first point is get your community on board, your neighbors on board, and get strong support. And then the piece is accurately mapping where the Phragmites is. As best you can, you need to know what the frag is, map it out as accurately as possible, because you're going to be using this information to develop the funding proposals to do the work, to identify what you need to do in your permits, and to gather the resources you need from manpower, from a contractor perspective. So it's been a huge project and a huge learning opportunity, and one of the things that I'm working on now is culminating all lessons learned over the last few years for this project. It's something that the Conservancy is hoping to make available to others that want to do this type of work. So I guess my offer at that point is perhaps we could work through the Invasive Plant Council to share some of our lessons learned once that information is available.
So another question just along those lines, Eric, could you explain what efforts you've taken to restore the site and you're relying on native seed banks?
So at this point we're relying on native seed banks, but I would qualify that by saying it's very early in the process. We only have really one complete year at this scale of information from the 2016 program and monitoring done in 2017 of that work. So we know from literature review and experience in other terrestrial sites that recolonization of native plants isn't very strong in the first year. We expect year 2 and 3 and 4 to see a substantial change in the vegetation communities that have been treated initially. A key part of that is make sure that we don't allow Phragmites to return to these sites. But of course, we'll be monitoring those going forward, and if there's a need for native plantings or seeding or other types of augmenting activities, we'll certainly undertake those.
This next question is regarding herbicides. Maybe I'll ask Michael if he might answer. If anyone's interested in spraying over water, what herbicides are available and what permits are required?
Okay, that's a question we get often, and the herbicide we used is a product that's registered in the United States. It's not available in Canada. We brought it in under an emergency use registration specifically for this job. That's the only thing it can be used for. That being said, the maker of this product is applied to seeking information about what requirements they're going to have to meet in order to register this product in Canada. So they're interested in bringing it to the Canadian market, but they want to find what hurdles they will have to jump over in order to do that. It's an alternative product from a different company, BASF, and they're also targeting it for water use. So particularly there are two products on the horizon that can be used. Right now there are 0. But stay tuned. Something may become registered and available.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
I was reading a new question that just came in here. Give us some idea. I'm not sure again who is Eric. What is the cost of this program? Do you have any kind of calculation or estimate that others could use when trying to put a program together?
I wish I did. There are so many moving parts to a project like this, from the staff time involved in prep work and planning and mapping. We were using helicopters to undertake mapping exercises in partnership with MNRF, to working through the permit process, to developing a rationale in support of the emergency use registration, right through to the implementation, and then all of the follow-up activities that we're doing right now. I don't have a number, per hectare off the top of my head that I could share today, but I can tell you it's quite expensive, and as we pull together some of our lessons learned, I hope to have a better idea of what the work actually costs. Our project is a bit different in that we are fortunate to have the access to this product. Most folks would not be applying aerially over water, so the cost could be substantially less in a terrestrial environment controlling Phragmites. My recommendation is to reach out to the OTC or other members of the Ontario Phragmites work group and get some names of some qualified contractors that are experienced in doing this work in types of environments, and they could give you an accurate quote of the cost for actual undertaking the spraying portion. I find it changes by geography and wetland type. We're fortunate to work in sandy and organic soils down here on Lake Erie. A project, in the Canadian Shield or, other parts of the province might be very different and have very different costs and considerations associated with it.
Just to follow up on that, Eric, what are the timelines? How many years do you expect to have to continue to work on this?
Well, it's hard to say. Our project team has been putting together what we are going to consider our geographical boundary. There is a lot of land that hasn't been treated yet in the Long Point Peninsula. So we're hoping that the federal government will come on board in the next few years and begin treating some of the lands. The reality is we have 2 or 3 more years at least of retreatment in areas that have been done and filling in the gaps between those areas. Realistically, work could go on for the rest of my career in some capacity, shape, or form, just, moving to the next jurisdiction. We know the plan is prolific across the province, and quite frankly, it's becoming that way across the country. So I expect if you're putting together a program like this, you should have a bit of a long-term vision in mind.
Another question for you, Eric. What's the rough percentage of wetland area in your study area that would have Phragmites monoculture versus intact emergent marsh communities?
That really depends by the participating property. We saw huge variations. We worked in one private wetland this year that was 65% heavily inundated with Phragmites, and worked in another property that just had a very small percentage, a couple of patches. So it really does vary. I think in my experience, what I've seen is it's determined by the management actions on the property over the past 20 or 30 years. So if there's been significant disturbance in exposed soils in the wetlands through channel maintenance or dredging activities or open water community creation, there really is an opportunity for that disturbed soil to colonize quickly in Phragmites. And you can see that readily in some of the air photos around, around your typical channels and water areas in some of these lands. So I think really at the end of the day, it's impossible to put a specific number on average, but from Point area, I would say it's above average for the province. It's pretty high, 30, 40, 50% in many wetlands, less in some, and I think we'll find in some areas it'll even be higher than 50%.
Thank you. Dustin, did you have anything to add to the presentation today or any comment that you'd like to share with our listeners?
No, nothing comes to mind unless there are any specific questions for me in regards to Crown Land itself.
Michael, did you have anything else that you'd like to add today?
Nothing from me. I think Eric covered it really well.
I think the questions are wrapping up here. So remind everyone that alternative to chemical spray, the Ontario Invasive Plant Council does have a best management practice document that's available on our website that can be used in smaller applications as to how to deal with this species. I'd like to thank all of our viewers today, and especially for our presenters for participating today. Note that our registration for the next webinar, the Pearl Blue Stripe, on March 7th will be open shortly. So thank you again, everyone, today for participating. Thank you, presenters, and look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you.